Today's video is brought to you by Glass Spider Publishing. Offering a wide range of hybrid book publishing services, Glass Spider Publishing is your one-stop shop for professional editing, design, publication, and book marketing services. Visit glassspiderpublishing.com today to learn more. Welcome back, everyone. Today's painting, I'm using a 16 by 20 inch canvas, and you may or may not be able to tell that it's actually a canvas I had previously painted on. I just gave it a quick coat of white paint and then a generous coat of gesso, and it's ready to go. And I'm starting out here by finding my horizon. I'm using my number 8 Filbert with a thin mixture of Payne's Gray and matte medium. And so there I've got my horizon. It's just below center. I drew it with the edge of my brush, and I'm just getting a little bit of that paint off of my brush rather than washing it off and wasting it, since that sky is going to be gray anyway. Now I'm going up to my number 12 Filbert. I did wet this in my jar slightly and then touch it onto a paper towel to take a little bit of the moisture out. And I'm making a mixture of Payne's Gray and titanium white, but I'm keeping it fairly dark. It's a pretty dark mixture that I'm going to apply on this right-hand side, because this is where my storm clouds are going to be the heaviest and the darkest. Now, this last couple weeks have been a little bit challenging for me. As most of you know, I've kind of dealt with some burnout and anxiety and things. And, you know, even though I'm able to kind of work past that right now, I'm still dealing with it a little bit. And so I've had a really hard time getting another painting going for the last couple of weeks. I've had a few false starts and stops. So this week I was super excited to get this painting done, and I'm pretty happy with it. But I wanted to remind you guys, because I think that sometimes you guys go through the same things too. When that happens, the only way that you actually fail, because I know it feels like you're a failure if you start a painting and it doesn't turn out right. But it's important to remind yourself that the only way that you can actually fail is by giving up. And there were definitely a couple of days where I thought, oh man, I'm really not doing good at this. Maybe I should just give up. Maybe I came back too soon, whatever. But I kept at it, and I'm pretty happy with it now. So I'm glad I didn't give up. As you can see here, I'm moving into a lighter mixture, and I added a little bit of ultramarine blue, just so the sky doesn't feel quite so black and white. It just gives it a little bit of a cool, just a bit of a cool tone that I felt really helped give that stormy feel, but I'm just barely using any ultramarine. You could skip it. You could add any other blue that you have or you like to use. And just make sure everything is pretty well blended in. It doesn't matter if you've got a little bit of some messy brush strokes in here. The clouds are really going to cover everything, but just get it generally pretty blended. Sticking with my number 12, just getting a darker bit of paint to make sure it's nice and dark on that stormy side. And bringing a little bit more medium over and kind of making a bit of a gray color. We need to make the base for our grasses, especially in the foreground, because that's where you're going to see some darkness in the grasses. So I took that dark gray mixture, added just a hint of blue to it, and putting it on the very bottom of the canvas. Make sure there's not a hard line as the color moves up, because that'll be hard to cover later. So just get some medium like I did there and just kind of lightly scumble it out just so it's softer. It'll be very easy to cover later. As you can see, I kind of already started my sweeping brush strokes, kind of sweeping it all up and to the right. We're gonna really play into that kind of brushwork as we start adding the grass colors. Same brush, have not cleaned it off. I'm gonna throw a little bit of my yellow ochre in there, or yellow oxide, either one. As far as I can tell, they're pretty much the same color. It's just some brands call it ochre, some brands call it oxide. So I'm getting a nice kind of muddy grayed down yellow. And we'll start blending it in to that darker color. I'm not just drawing hard, straight diagonal lines, you know, just straight from the left corner to the right corner in a hard line, but all of my brushwork is kind of sweeping upward to the right. At least on the bottom portion here. We're gonna flatten it out as we move toward the horizon. So you'll see what I mean here in just a sec. So just sweeping it up and to the right. Letting it blend with that dark color. And as I move toward the horizon, I'm going to brighten it a little bit more. And I'm going to start pulling my brushwork a little bit flatter until it's completely flat at the horizon. Throwing some white in there, because as we move into the distance, things become lighter and grayer. So we definitely want to lighten it up as we move out and flatten out those brush strokes. Notice here I'm not going right up to the horizon line because we're going to have some distant trees and shrubs and whatever there. So I'm just kind of leaving a little white spot where I'm going to put that. Blend it in nice and smooth with the part of the grass that's swooping upward. And moving down to my number 8, I believe, getting some medium and some panes. It's a pretty heavy mixture of the panes. It's not completely transparent, but I did add a good amount of medium to it. Now I'm just going to use the side of my brush and kind of carve in a distant line right on the horizon. I don't want it to just be a hard black line though, so you can see there I'm kind of going back, dabbing at it a little just to break up that top line. Do not try to make tree shapes. Let me show you here. Zoom it in a bit so you can see I kind of make the line, and then I go back and just kind of break up the top edge so it's not real crisp in all areas on that top edge. As we move to the right, I break it up more and make it a little bit wider, kind of suggesting that the background is kind of wrapping around and it's a little bit closer to us on that right side. So you see there a heavier, fatter line. Sorry, it kind of goes off camera there for a second. I was really in the zone. And I'm just tapping and breaking up that top edge, making larger shapes than I did on the left-hand side. Back to my number 8, cleaned off, getting some of my grass color. Now, as I do the grass colors, sometimes it can be hard to tell you what colors I mixed up, but it's always going to be a mixture of my yellow, white, Payne's gray, and occasionally some ultramarine. So I want you to feel comfortable to just really mix it up every time. Get a different variation of those colors. Push some of it closer toward green. Push some of it closer toward gray. You know, get some that is more vibrant yellow. We want darker tones, lighter tones. Really mix it up every time you go back for more paint. I like keeping the more solid yellow tones right around the house that's going to be there. And I like the darker values right in the foreground because that helps show you how deep the grass is. Other than that, just kind of feel free to mix it up however looks good for you. So I'm kind of blending with the very tip of my brush into that distant tree line that I did. The paint is still a little wet and I did apply it pretty heavy, so I've got some time to blend it into my grasses here, but if yours is dry, I wouldn't worry about it if it doesn't blend too much. I'm just working kind of short, horizontal brush strokes there. I'm not trying to blend them all out. Leave some of them kind of streaky. It's going to make it feel like the grasses are really blowing in the wind and they're kind of pressed down. Sticking with my number 8, gonna load up with some Payne's gray and some white, going for that gray cloud mixture again. A little bit of blue to increase the storminess. And a bit of medium. I'm using the side of my brush to kind of carve in the little scoopy shapes of the top of the clouds. And this is why I've been asked a lot, why am I not going to produce my cloud brushes anymore? And it's because I don't use them anymore. The way that I paint has changed a lot. And I find that I have much more control over what my clouds look like when I use this brush as opposed to the cloud brushes that I used to make. And I mean, I could certainly still use those to make brushes or to make clouds, but I feel like this brush will do anything and everything that brush can do and more. So I'm just kind of laying in the overall shape, not really worried about what's lighter, what's darker. I'm just kind of getting my shape on there with this thinned down lightish gray. Adding a little distant rain coming out of that cloud, just with the side of my brush. And I was getting a lot of canvas texture there because I used gesso on the canvas. So just pick up a little medium and that kind of helps streak everything, make it a little bit smoother. Same thing here. It's just the only real difference is as I move across the canvas and the background gets a little lighter, I have to lighten my mixture a little bit. Other than that, it's the exact same thing I did on the right-hand side there. But see how I'm kind of nudging the tip of that brush to create the little billowy tops of the clouds. And it gives a nice broken edge so I don't get these overly bubble-shaped clouds. I had to come back to these clouds a few times and just make some adjustments. It had been a long time since I painted clouds. I was trying to think of the last time I painted clouds and I couldn't think of when it was. It might have been during the pandemic in 2020. I made a video about painting clouds in a few different ways, and I'll try and dig that up and put it in the information card up at the top of your screen. But yeah, I made a video about painting clouds, I think 4 different ways. And I think that was the last time I painted clouds. Just a little medium there. It helps to reactivate some of the paint on my brush. I want to work really thin right now. That's why I'm using so much medium. I'm just wanting to lay in the beginning shapes of my clouds. So I want this paint to be very thin. So don't be stingy with the medium here. The thinner they are at this point, the more room you have to work with them and make changes as you go. The thicker your paint is right here, the more you're stuck with whatever brush strokes you end up getting. So err on the side of safety and work that paint very thin right now. Remember that it's important to highlight your clouds on the interior. Don't keep your highlights of your clouds on the outer edge. That's going to look really phony and amateur. So it's okay to start there like I did there, but then you want to pull it down inside of the cloud. Gonna go a little bit lighter. And I have less medium. I don't think I picked up any medium there, but I am kind of scumbling. Since this is a stiff bristle brush, it pushes the paint around really well. And so you can scumble to also get thinner paint. And that's kind of what I'm doing here. I know the bottom of that little rain area looks really messy and not good, but I'm not worried about it because my intention is to come back in a little bit and fix up the bottom of that. See how I'm pulling that highlight into the cloud. Definitely leave some dark, a little bit of shadow is going to help sell the light more than just adding more light. Definitely keep some dark in there. Now I've moved to my 5/8 inch angle and I'm mixing up a dark color pretty close to the color that's already at the base of the sky, the background color that I made. And a bit of medium. And now I'm going to start from the base of the sky, just above the trees, and I'm going to lightly blend up, kind of glaze it up over the base of that rain area. And that kind of gives it that look that it's just misting down. It's a medium, and that helps to glaze it up throughout. I think that looks much better. Just makes it a little bit more of a subtle effect, which is exactly what I wanted. And I decided that part of the sky wasn't quite dark enough, so just darkening it up a little bit more, primarily with some medium so that I'm not just repainting the whole background. I'm kind of glazing the darkness over what's already there. Little extra water, my paints were starting to dry out. Just darkening up the base of this cloud a little bit. Blending it up with some medium. I really wanted this cloud over here to have a nice dark, dark base. I feel like the one on the right might not be quite as dark underneath because it's raining a little bit. It's losing some of its mass. But this one here, I felt I didn't want to take the rain all the way across, so I thought this one might be a little darker underneath since it hasn't yet started raining. Make sure you use that medium so that you don't paint over everything you already did. You can just kind of blend up into it. If you're not using medium, not only do I highly recommend it, but you can use a little bit of water to blend. Just be really careful with it because it can thin down your paint too much. Water can thin down your paint unpredictably. Sometimes you think that's going to be enough and it's way too much. Sometimes you think that's going to be enough and it's nowhere near enough. I just find that when I try to use water instead of medium, that I struggle, and a lot of times I end up thinning down my paint too much. But the medium makes everything really smooth. It really smooths down the paint, and I feel like gives you a lot more control over the transparency that you have. Just dragging a little bit of that thin shadow color into a few other areas. Remember that you cannot sell light and highlights and reflections. You can't really sell them without having shadows and darkness. That's what's going to make your lights look so impressive and so vibrant. Back to my number 8 and mixing up that cloud color again. We're going to get back to making some cloud shapes. Still using some medium, but not making it quite as transparent as before. Just a very, very light touch. I have a lot of paint on my brush, so I need to control how much of the brush is touching the canvas and what kind of pressure I'm using to put the brush on the canvas. So it's a very light touch at this point. Don't be afraid to stick your fingers in there and smear that paint out. I think that gives such beautiful wispy blends that really work with clouds. Now it's starting to look like a cloud with a little bit of mass to it rather than just a weird gray jellyfish with an eyeball that needed to be covered up. I'm still not using pure white. Don't jump straight to pure white. Save the pure white for the very, very end when you're just giving your final touches of highlight. I'm just going back to my darker shadow color for a second there to get that blended in where it's so dark. There was just a big value difference there. Felt like it was a little light toward that back side of this cloud. So I'm just going to darken it just a little bit and kind of let it wisp into the dark background, just kind of blur into it a bit more. And I felt like I lost a little bit too much of my shadow, so I'm just putting a little bit of shadow back in. Just kind of the same thing over here, just redefining that top edge before pulling some of that highlight color down into the body of the cloud. Notice that I did just pick up white there, but my brush still has that blue-gray mixture on it, so that is not pure white that I'm applying to the canvas. But also, we're gonna do something in a little bit that we've talked about in past videos, but I can't think of a time when I actually showed you how to do it. So sometimes people will say, my white isn't bright enough. How do I make my white brighter? Well, one of the ways you make your white brighter is, like I already said, you make your darks darker. That's going to make your white appear brighter. But also, beyond that, you can make your white appear brighter. So here, all of the white that I'm applying is a little bit on the gray side and definitely on the blue side, so that it's a very cool color. What I'm going to do in a little bit is take some white and mix it with my yellow ochre, and that's going to give me a very bright, warm yellow. And even though that's not really going to be any lighter than the next lightest color that I put on here, the warmth is going to make it feel like it's really reflecting some bright light, and it will make it appear a little bit brighter. So The two ways you can make your whites brighter: make your darks darker, and then change the temperature of your color. If you're working in a very warm palette, you can try and make your whites a little bit cooler, maybe shift toward purple a little. Or if you're working in a very cool palette, warm those whites up with a little bit of yellow. I got way too shapey in these clouds right here in the middle. I ended up making it two very distinct clouds separate from each other, and I didn't like that. You can kind of see me starting to do it here, but I do come back in a little bit and blend them together, make them one large cloud. So I bring that up now just so that you know that if there's something going on in your clouds that you're not completely in love with at this point, please don't worry about it. You can make changes to them at any point, especially if you're using thin layers. Like I told you, remember, when they're thick, you're gonna have a much harder time changing them later. Much brighter over here in this corner. I feel like the sky might be clearing or thinking about clearing on this side, so I made it a little bit brighter. Painting this huge sky of clouds after having not done it for a very long time really makes me want to do it again. So it's quite possible we'll be seeing more cloudy sky paintings. So let me know if you like that idea and what else you might like to see with that cloudy sky. Just getting progressively lighter and lighter. That's why I'm grabbing the white and then mixing it off into another area. I don't want to clean my brush and get rid of the gray blue that's on there, but I don't want to just keep mixing it in the same area because then it's not really getting much lighter. Here I'm using a lot of medium and kind of making those clouds wisp out right there. That's how I get the really foggy, kind of misty, thin looking clouds. Just a little bit of paint and a good amount of medium. Getting a little bit heavier there with the paint application, because we're starting to get toward the lightest colors that I want to see. Just picked up some medium there to very subtly highlight it toward the back. So I'm using that same bright white color that I was using in the heavier area, but because I thinned it down so much, it doesn't appear quite as bright. Just finding kind of a little meditative peace in making these clouds here. Remembering that you can go back at any time and make any changes. Don't let yourself get worked up if something's not looking right. Now, if you notice, I went down to my number 8 Filbert. This is my small, soft Filbert from my original line of brushes. And I mixed up white with just the tiniest hint of gray because I don't want it to be pure white. And then I added some of my yellow to it and some medium. And I'm very lightly, in very small dabs, adding some of this yellower white, and that's going to start to feel a lot brighter than some of the other white that I've used on there so far. See how if you squint at what I just added, it's not much brighter than the color around it, but that warmth makes it feel like it's glowing, so it makes it feel like it's brighter. I know it's hard to see what's going on my palette there, and I apologize for that. Somehow my lights above me got turned up a little bit. The brightness got increased, and I didn't notice it until I sat down to edit the video. So my palette is a little bit blown out. Here's where I make those clouds way too separate and distinct, this one and the one above it. And I definitely got carried away just adding way too much of the highlight color. But I'll show you how I come back. I add more of the low light and I pull those two clouds together into one. I ended up really loving the shape of these wispy clouds on the left side of the canvas, where I feel like the storm might be kind of breaking up a little bit. Just pretty much picking up pure white right there, though I still have the other colors on my brush. I think the most important part, the most important thing to remember when painting clouds is that you paint them just like you paint anything else. All it is shapes and colors and values. That's it. It's not about, how do you paint a cloud? Well, you paint a cloud the same way as you paint anything else. You just kind of plan out where the shapes, values, and colors go and how they relate to each other. But the other thing that I think is really important when you're working with clouds is not to make them too shapy. Don't get too into your head about what shape a cloud is, because there is an absolute infinite number of shapes that a cloud can have, as well as textures. And you might see a cloud that has a very distinct shape, But if you were to move to another area and look at that same cloud, you might see it from a different angle and see that it's not a distinct cloud from the one behind it. It might blend into it a bit. And if you watch it over a period of time, it probably is going to blend into the cloud next to it, or it will detach itself from the cloud next to it. So don't get too in your mind about clouds are shaped like this, because sometimes they might be, other times they're not. And so clouds really can be whatever it is that you need them to be, whatever it is that you want them to be. Just try not to make them too, I guess, wormy. I think that we've all been guilty of making wormy clouds. I certainly have made my fair share of cloud worms, and I kind of have cloud worms going on right now between these two clouds I'm working on, but I feel like I get it taken care of pretty good. Just giving some little swoopy, blurry bits to some of the clouds over here. Here comes Mr. Moon. He's missed you guys. He cannot avoid making an appearance in each of my videos these days. Right here is where I decided I did not like those being two very different clouds. So just right over the top of them with a little bit of highlight color. And I know that I lose way too much of my shadow color, but we'll come at it back in a little bit. Kind of looked like a cow skull for a minute there. Got a little stiff and solid looking. I was really starting to overwork this cloud here. So I believe this was actually the next day, and I decided to work on the shadows a little bit more, especially in this middle cloud, before we move on to the rest of the painting. So that's what I'm doing here, just deepening some of those shadows on the back, and then pretty sure I'm going to add in a few more shadow areas throughout that highlighted area, because right now it just kind of looks like one bright blob to me. So I got to darken it down and get a few more shadows in there. Sometimes when you get a little carried away adding highlights, as I did on that center cloud, then you kind of end up losing the shape of the cloud. It starts to look just kind of like a blob. But if you notice how I kind of am going underneath with that darker color, I'm kind of bringing back some of those billowy forms. So yeah, if you end up overworking your white, like I did, just come back at it later with some of your darker color, and you can bring back those shapes a bit. Don't leave your cloud as just a big white blob. There's no reason to do that. You can get back the billow. All right, we're gonna let our clouds kind of sit and think about what they've done for a minute. And I have a little tracing element here. It's a free download on my website. There's a link in the video description. This is just based off of a quick sketch that I did, but I found that trying to sketch it right onto my canvas was taking a lot of additional time. I didn't figure you wanted to see me draw a line, erase it, move it again, and just kind of hem and haw over how this should be drawn. So I sketched it out real quick on some paper. So when you get this tracing element, you'll notice it's a little messier than some of my other ones because it's not taken from a photo. It's straight up scribbled onto paper by myself. So I'm just tracing it on here. I just kind of scribbled some white chalk along the lines on the back of the paper. And then I'm just going over those lines with a pen, and it's transferring the chalk onto the canvas. Just for those of you who have never done this before, I get questions about how to do it every once in a while. You know, it seems kind of magical. It's really not. It's very, very simple. I missed a couple of lines in my drawing, so after I trace this, I do go back with my chalk pencil and just add a couple of extra lines. Now, the important thing to remember when you are applying your tracing element, or if you're going to freehand draw your house, that's fine too. The most important thing to remember is to keep your vertical lines, so that's the up and down parts of the house, keep those vertical lines in line with the edge of your canvas. Notice my house is moving off into the distance toward the left, so my horizontal lines are all angled. So if my vertical lines are angled with that, my house is going to look really crooked. It's going to look like it's falling down. It's going to look really bizarro. So just keep those vertical lines straight up and down, in line with the edge of your canvas. And I placed this with that, the back edge on the left, just slightly below the horizon. This painting was partly inspired by a place that my grandparents lived when I was growing up. And it was a very rural area like this, and just got the most amazing thunderstorms. And it was just so beautiful. And I haven't been there in more than 20 years now, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. So this painting was kind of an ode to that place. This house doesn't look like the house my grandparents lived in, but there were many houses in the area that were very similar. All right, so my tracing is on there. I touched up some of the lines with my chalk pencil. Now I'm back to my number 8 Filbert. Mr. Moon's going nuts. Sorry about that. I cannot shut him up. I'm mixing up a blue-gray color. Now I'm going to add some of those shadows back into this cloud before we move on. Keeping this paint on the transparent side though. That is already looking so much better. Just getting that hint of shadow in there. Cleaned off my brush, going back into my pure white, and just kind of touching up some of the highlights that I lost by adding that shadow back in. Definitely not going to cover the shadow all the way again, but it just looked a little flat because I had painted over most of my highlights. So I'm just going to touch that up and then we'll move on. A little bit of yellow just to get that warm color again. Yeah, Mr. Moon likes to just walk through my house meowing at the top of his lungs all day, every day. And I've discovered that if I try to make him stop, he just meows more. So I just kind of have to ignore him. All right, I'm moving on to, this is my number 6 round, and just mixing up gray and white. I'm not adding any of the blue to it. And we're gonna start filling in our house. Go ahead and go down into the yellow color. Don't try to avoid it. But again, remember to leave a soft line at the very base of the house because we're gonna cover up with the grass and with bushes later. So as always, the soft line is much easier to cover up than a hard, heavy line. Just pretty much covering this whole side in a single color. The color's a little different every time I go back for more, but it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna get the whole side covered in this shadow color. See, it's a lot lighter right there, but it's not a big deal. You could definitely add some color to this house if you like. I thought about making it, you know, red, like a red farmhouse type, but I liked the moodiness of the gray much better. You could add a little bit of burnt sienna to the color if you want and give it more of a, less of a weathered wood look, a little bit more of a live wood with, you know, some warm undertones. But again, you know me, I like some moody, I like some gray, so that's what we did. Besides, I wanted the grass and the wheat or whatever it is that's growing here, the way that it's blowing and moving in the wind, I wanted that to really be kind of the show-stopping color in the painting. So that's why everything else is fairly monochromatic, but that grass I wanted to make nice and vibrant. It kind of also helps it feel like the sun might be peeking through in the clouds in an area where we can't see in the canvas and shining some vibrant light on the grasses. Now in here, this is under like a patio. I'm going to paint it much darker since there's no direct light hitting it because it's covered. So even though this side of the house where the front door is the area that I feel like is taking the most direct light, this is going to be the darkest area of the house. I know my front door is really crooked there, but I'm not terribly worried about it. You're not really even going to be able to see it much once the painting is done. And that's just my chalk line, so I'm not sweating it too much. Up underneath the roof of the house line, I'm making that nice and dark because it's also being shadowed by the roof. And then I'll make it a little bit lighter toward the bottom. But this dormer window, I feel like, is taking a large amount of direct light. So we're going to make it nice and light. There used to be a house similar to this nearby where I live, and I would drive by it every once in a while, and I was just always fascinated with it. I wanted to go into it, but there's like no trespassing signs all over the place, and I'm kind of a rule follower when it comes to things like that. I don't really want to be arrested for trespassing, which I know is strange, right? So I never got to go in it, and now it's gone, and that just breaks my heart. Makes me really sad. Here I did add just a little bit of yellow into that gray mixture because I'm going to start adding it to the roof. And I feel like the roof, because it's angled up toward the sky, it's taking the most direct light. And so I want to warm it up a little bit. And just like in the clouds, that little bit of warmth is going to help it feel a little bit brighter. And up on the main roof as well. Keep a clean, damp brush handy. I kind of get outside of my roof line here at the top, but I wasn't terribly worried about it. If you keep a clean, damp brush handy, when you get outside of your lines, you can just take that brush and wipe away anything that got errant. And I'm going to show you that here in just a few minutes. But you want to get to it before it dries. Don't let it dry. And here's that little highlight right under the eaves. It's such a small thing, but I think it really helps give it a bit more of a polished look than just having it completely dark under there. And I am going to run just a hint of it down the edge here because you might have a little bit of light that kind of sneaks around the corner there and under the roof of the porch. Though I am going to glaze it down, so you know how I like to do. Add some stuff and then paint some stuff over it. A little bit of a lighter color. I know it looks really blue on my palette there. It's not. I don't think there's any blue in there. It's just the way that my palette is getting blown out by the lights above. So this is pretty much just a Payne's and white mixture with some matte medium, of course. And I'm kind of dragging my brush strokes side to side to give the indication that there might be some boards on the outside of the house. But you could certainly skip that if you're not comfortable with it, and then it could look like painted stucco or whatever. If you wanted it to look like brick instead of boards, you could kind of do some horizontal and some vertical brush strokes, and that might give that kind of an indication. Just kind of going back and forth with some darker and some lighter, just creating that texture as well as the highlighted difference. And if it's easier for you to just ignore the windows and paint over them at this point, you can do that. We are going to go back and fill in those windows with almost pure Payne's gray. So you can do that over top of the paint if you prefer, if that's easier for you. I considered doing that here, just painting over the windows, but ultimately I decided it wasn't that much work for me to just paint around them. Get a little bit darker up here under the eaves. And I like a little bit of shadow toward the bottom. I don't know how realistic that is, having a shadow at the bottom, but it doesn't really matter because it's what I like to see. So I added it, and if you feel like it's unnecessary in your painting, you are more than welcome to skip it. I know it looks really forced right now, but it's not done, obviously. We're gonna add more layers to it. Tiny bit of blue in there now. Because it's going to help just kind of create some variation in the roof. So I go back and forth between adding some of that warmer, yellower gray and some of this cooler, bluer gray. And here with that warmer color. This piece of roof over the porch is angled more sharply, more directly at the sky. So I add much more of this warmer color to it than to the other piece of roof, which is slanted down a little bit and might not be taking quite as direct of sunlight as the lower part. Got to paint in the little roof on the dormer. Almost forgot about it. I used the cool blue. That piece of the roof, while it is angled toward the sky, I feel like it's facing away from where the sun is coming from. So I just put the cool blue on it to kind of help indicate that it's taking light. It's just not taking as much light. And it's a little shadowier, especially toward the bottom. Just scumbling a hint of that shadowy color into the rest of the roof as well, mostly just to help build some texture, not really because I think it needs any shadow on it. There we go with the clean damp brush, just kind of wiping away some of those brush strokes that got outside of our shape. this little piece of the dormer wall is going to be quite dark because it is absolutely facing away from the light. So just like the top of the wall on the right-hand side, it's going to be very dark. And then it's going to cast a bit of a shadow onto the roof. Matte medium always helps when your paint doesn't want to blend or smear. Just a little bit of medium and you got it. Kind of just getting some Payne's gray and filling in our windows. Not worried about the crossbar on the windows. I don't actually know why I put that on my tracing element. That's details. It's because I was just sketching and sketched in details too. So don't worry about the crossbars on your windows. Just paint over them. Get those windows nice and dark inside. I like that my house is leaning ever so slightly. I don't know if it's my drawing or if it's that I placed it a little crooked on my canvas or my brush strokes or a combination of all of them. But my house is leaning ever so slightly. And I really, really like that. It kind of adds to the look that it's a very old farmhouse. And I don't know if you've ever been driving in the country where you see old barns or sheds or farmhouses out in a field somewhere, and it's clear that nobody's lived in it or used it in a very long time. And it's just kind of leaning a little to one side. I really love when I see buildings like that. So I'm kind of excited that this little house unintentionally turned out like that. I feel like if I had tried to make it like that, it just would have looked crooked and weird. So I'm glad it accidentally turned out like that. I'm back to my number 3 round and I have my medium gray color and I'm putting in my posts that are holding up the roof of the porch and some of the little detail railing works. But I'm not going to get too crazy with them right now. I'm just putting them in there with that light gray so that I don't lose them. Going a little bit darker under the windows because we'll have some little windowsills or something, and there just might be a little extra shadow there, or even just some water staining right under the windows. Either way, I like to just make it a little darker right under the windows. Kind of lost that roof line a little, bringing it back there with some Payne's Gray. I meant to tell you earlier, yes, you can use Mars Black instead of Payne's Gray here. It's not going to give you quite the stormy, soft color. It's going to be a little bit on the browner side, and it's definitely going to be stronger and more aggressive. But yeah, you can use it in place of Payne's Gray. I just almost always prefer Payne's Gray to Mars Black. If you don't have Payne's Gray and you want to use it instead of Mars Black, I would recommend just pre-mixing some ultramarine with burnt umber. That's going to give you a really nice Payne's Gray. It's a very soft color. You can angle it a little bit toward the blue side or a little bit toward the brown side if you like. So yeah, if you don't have Payne's Gray, you can definitely make it that way. Just working on details, kind of pumping up shadows, pumping up highlights. Well, no, not details. I'm not doing detail work. It's just the shadows and the highlights. Don't worry about details just yet. Barely touching the canvas there, just kind of scraping in some horizontal lines to indicate boards. All right, our house is pretty good for now. We'll come back in a little bit, kind of punch some of our values and work our details. But let's take a break from it and work on our wheat field. So I'm still using my number 8 Filbert, and I'm just gonna mix up some more of my wheat type colors. Remember, you just wanna get a variation of these colors in there, not only in how yellow or how green the color is, but also how dark or how light the color is. So really play with these 4 colors here and see what kind of variations you can get. I'm mixing a little bit of medium in, but not really for any amount of transparency. That color was not quite different enough from what's already going on there, so I'm just going to change it up a bit. My brush strokes here are going to be similar to what we did in the first place, but different in that I'm using the tip of the brush, if you can tell there, and I'm getting individual brush strokes. So you really want to focus on creating that sweeping motion. Don't have everything coming up from the bottom angled at the exact same angle. I'm kind of sweeping up and down, getting it to look like it's really blowing and kind of undulating in the wind. And then up in the top half of this wheat field area, my brush strokes are going horizontal. I'm leaving a lot of that dark showing at the bottom, but I will end up going back and adding more. See there, I'm going nice and slow so that you can see my brush work. The brush is touching the canvas as it moves up, but it's also touching as it moves down, which is going to give me two distinct looking lines. So make sure that your brush touches on the way up as well as the way down so that you can get a good amount of variation in the shape of those grasses. Changing it up again, just going a little bit brighter, a little more of the yellow, a little less of the panes. And back here where the horizontal brush strokes are, try to make them just a little bit smaller. Don't make them as long, and maybe don't put as much pressure on your brush so that they're a little more narrow too. Just keep in mind, remember that as things move away from us, they're going to get smaller. So if that brushwork is large, long, and wide in the back, like it is in the front, it's going to throw off your perspective a little bit. If your lines, particularly in the grasses that are angled at the bottom, if those lines are too fuzzy, you're not really getting any kind of a crisp line, just add a tiny bit of extra water to the mixture on your brush. You know what, I actually am using my number 6 Filbert here. This is not my number 8. It's a little bit smaller because I wanted to get more of a distinct shape with the tip of the brush. So that's why I went down to my number 6. Absolutely go over the bottom of the house there. That's going to help anchor the house to the ground. But also, if the grasses and wheat or whatever it is are blowing in the wind, they're definitely going to overlap the base of the house. This is my number 10 round brush, and I'm still just mixing up grass colors. But this brush, particularly with a little bit of water in it, is going to give me some really nice distinct lines. I feel like I'm kind of missing out on those shapes in the back around the house. So I figured this softer brush was going to help me get that a little bit better. still keeping those brighter, lighter colors right near the house. I will have a little bit of it in the foreground, but primarily I wanted the area right around the house to be the brightest part of the field. Just helps draw a little bit of extra attention to the house. Cleaned off my brush, getting some paints. And a good amount of blue. I'm gonna go for a dark greenish color here. So it's about 50% paints, 50% ultramarine, and then some yellow to get a really dark sagey green. However, I did feel like I was struggling to get a readable green, a good readable green for the highlights of these bushes. So I do bring in cad medium or cad yellow light in a little bit, but we're just going to start off with this mixture. I'm just kind of dabbing it around the base of the house. Don't worry about blending it in with the grass too much. I'm just kind of breaking up the bottom so it's not harder. It's not hard to blend in later. But kind of dab it all around the base of the house, overlapping the house a bit. Kind of left a little opening there for a front porch for the house, but you don't have to. You could definitely close that off if you like. Just gonna lighten it up a little bit, see if we can get that color a little bit brighter. The thing is with ultramarine and yellow ochre, you're never really gonna get a true green. You're never gonna get a real vibrant green. It's always going to be really dusty and really sagey, which at this distance in those bushes, I just felt like it didn't really read as green enough. But it's a good start. Just getting some overgrown bushes in there. I'd been working on this for a few days at this point, so my yellow is all dried up. Just back to some of my wheat color, and I'm kind of dragging that up into those bushes just a little bit, and that paint that I did the bushes with is still a little wet, so it's blending a bit. If it doesn't blend, it's not a big deal. The grasses can overlap it and kind of cover where it meets. Back to my number 6. Just making up some more of my grassy wheat colors. A nice dark green there for the foreground. Little extra water to get some distinct grassy shapes in there. Pulling a little bit of that out into the horizontal area, but it's primarily going to be here in the front and primarily toward the base of the grass shapes. Just helps give the wheat and the grasses some depth. Going to my number 6 round, and I've got some cad yellow light on my palette now, and I'm gonna mix up a nice dark but vibrant green. So I mix some panes with ultramarine, and I'm gonna put in little bits of the cad yellow at a time. Cad yellow can be strong, so I don't wanna just jump right in there and scoop a bunch up. So that's why I'm adding it just a tiny bit at a time. And I'm going to concentrate this color toward the base of these shapes. It's much darker, but it's also a little bit more of a true green. Not covering everything I added before, just kind of adding to it. Little bits of matte medium there just to kind of blend it into the grasses. I don't remember if the grass color here was still wet or if it was dry by this time. It doesn't really matter. The matte medium will help give a blended effect, even if that yellow is completely dry. Bit more of both of my yellows. I added both because the cad yellow on its own will make that green too vibrant and too sour. So adding both yellows, I get best of both worlds. I get the vibrancy and the true green from the cad yellow, but the yellow ochre will help kind of bring it down to a little bit more of a natural earthy green. That's much better. That's just about exactly the green that I was looking for in the first place. But I'm just adding it strategically kind of here and there. Only the high points, the points that I really want to emphasize of these bushes are getting this more vibrant green. So all those dusty greens are still there and they're still showing. Just mixing what was on my brush there into the yellow ochre for one more little punch of a brighter color. Clean brush, getting some Payne's Gray, and I'm just touching up those distant trees. They got a little transparent. If yours are fine, if there's no real brush strokes or transparency issues, don't worry about that. And while we're at it, I forgot to fill in the front door of the old farmhouse, so I'm just using that Payne's Gray to fill that in. A more transparent version of that color. We're just going to kind of start punching in a little bit of our details as far as like our values go. There's a couple values I still needed to work on before we do our detail work. So just redarkening my darkest areas with this Payne's Gray. Didn't clean off my brush, just wiped off some of that Payne's, mixing into my wheat colors, and I did include just a little bit of the Cad Yellow Light this time. I'm just going to punch the brightness in the grasses around the house one more time. Nice small brush strokes. Need a little bit of that brightness in here, but notice how delicate I'm being with the work. I don't want to just slash these lines on. I want them to be special. Maybe they're little tufts of the wheat that are more mature or more a drier part of the grass, some little seed heads, something. I just want it to feel a little bit different and almost be a little more detailed, but without getting in there and drawing little individual seed heads for all of these little grass strands. That would be too much detail, and I feel like it would take away from the house. So just some more delicate brushwork, but really in the exact same manner as the other brushwork that's there, I felt like was enough. Definitely need to use a little extra water, and I'm picking up a bit more paint, but I'm using a very delicate touch. I'm barely touching the canvas. Now I'm going to my long liner with a little extra water on it and picking up that same color I was working on, just maybe intensifying it and lightening it a little bit. I made sure I had a little blob on the tip of my brush there, and just very, very delicate. Very soft movements, barely touching. A little extra water if you're not getting a lot of paint off. Still long liner, just another dark green color for the exact same technique as that last lighter color. Primarily concentrating these darker streaks, again, toward the base of the grasses in the foreground here. A little bit is going up, but primarily the darker brush strokes should stay toward the bottom. All right, I'm going to my number 3. We're going to work on our house for a minute, just kind of knock in the details and be done with it. I've got some burnt sienna and a little Payne's gray. We got to get the chimney in there. I almost forgot about the chimney. So just kind of a dirty old brick color with some white. And we'll paint in one side of the chimney with this slightly lighter color. And then we'll paint in the other side with a darker version that's mostly just the burnt sienna and Payne's gray. And I mixed up a little bit of a lighter color here, thinking I'd go ahead and do my highlights, but the paint was a little bit too wet, so don't worry about doing your highlights or your low lights on the chimney right now. Just put in your two main colors, your light and your shadow, and then let it dry and come back to it in a little bit. As you can see, I did not listen to that advice and instead continued to try to highlight and low light it. All right, clean brush, still my number 3 round. Got some Payne's, kind of pulled it to the side, and I'm gonna mix a good amount of medium in there. I want it to be pretty transparent. It's maybe not quite a 50-50 mixture, maybe 60% paint to 40% medium. And I'm going to glaze this slightly transparent color on the underside of the porch roof here. It's not going to take away all of that little bit of highlighting that I did, but it's going to make sure that the shadow is nice and dark. I just want the door under there to barely be visible. I'm also going to add a window, but neither one of them do that I want to show very strongly. They're really obscured by the shadow cast from this overhang. So don't get too wrapped up in the details of the door and the window is what I'm getting at here. A little hint of gray. And I'm going to put in just a couple of horizontal lines to indicate where the stairs might be. I mean, you don't have to do that if you don't want. I just picked up a tiny point of white and I'm barely going to give it just a little highlight just to kind of show you that that's what's there. And that's all I'm going to do to the stairs. I think those are fairly believable stairs for being so simple. Barely touching the canvas, I'm just kind of scratching little hints of that white on my brush onto some of the edges. Right here, it's the posts. And then the roof line. So what I like to do there is kind of dip my brush into the white, wipe it on my palette, and what that does is it gets rid of a lot of the excess white, but it also presses my brush into kind of a flat chisel shape, which is really nice for these super crisp little lines. So just suggestions of that white, and it's not outlining everything in this hard white line. It's kind of dotting across. Some parts of the roof line get a lot of the color, some get very little, some get none at all. And I think that's more believable than just dragging a hard white line down the edge of everything. See, I dunked into the white, splatted it down on my canvas or my palette, and then I did pick up a tiny point of medium because that kind of breaks up the paint as well. Sometimes you'll just get medium, sometimes you'll get paint. Just gives a little bit more of a random application. Just a bit of a lighter highlight on that dormer, the wall of that dormer window. A little bit of a highlight on what looks like to be the floor of the porch. And now I'm gonna kind of scratch in a little window. I didn't even draw a window there, but I'm ever so lightly just kind of roughing in a window shape with some of that drying white paint that's on my brush. I'm gonna do the same thing around the edge of the door. There's very little paint on my brush, except right there, obviously. And it's just a soft outline. Let's do a similar thing around the other windows, but it doesn't have to be quite as soft and indistinct since these windows are actually taking a little bit of light. So I mixed a little bit of matte medium in there as well. So just roughening the window frame, and then the little part in the middle that separates the window panes. Figured the door kind of needed one of those, and so did this window. Notice I'm only doing 3 sides of these windows. Since this side that I'm working on is turned toward the right, we're not going to see really the window frame on the left-hand side. So I just did the top, the right, and the bottom. Likewise, the dormer window is kind of turned to our left, so we don't see the frame on the right-hand side. Did that bottom part almost like a window ledge. So slightly pulled it out of the window shape on the right-hand side to make it look like it's poking out from the window. And I kind of figured the plants were covering up the base of that window, so I didn't bother putting in the window ledge on that lower window. A little bit of my yellow ochre white mixture, still using my number 3. Then we're just going to pop the highlight on the roof one more time with that warm color. I didn't want it to go toward white though, so that's why instead of lightening it more, I chose to add the yellow. I felt like to lighten it more would make it compete with the sky. And I thought it would take away from the old dingy look. I think it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if it's the colors I'm using or the method that I'm using or a combination of both, but something about this house looks like pastels or chalk to me. I thought that was really interesting. Looks like pastel on paper. But I think it's cool. It kind of gives it a little bit of an otherworldly look. Just mixing up my different gray colors for texture and highlight and shadow on the roof. A little more white. Let's work on the detail of the boards here a bit. So kind of pressing that brush flat on my palette again so that I can get a nice chisel effect. Make it look like there's some individual boards there, but without getting crazy and actually drawing individual boards. Clean number 3 round. Some panes and some medium, nice and transparent. We're going to glaze down the window and the door on the front of the house, just to make sure that they're there, but they're not too there. We just want to give the suggestion that they're there. Same up here, just deepening the shadow under the eaves one more time. Just still using panes and medium. There I go again, putting a little bit of a shadow under the windows. And you can even kind of drag it down to make it look like there's water staining, water that's been running down the side of the house underneath those windows. Back into my burnt sienna, mixing it with panes. We're going to work on the chimney one more time. So I've just got that brick color. We're going to put some white in there, make a color that's quite a bit lighter than what I did in the first place. I'm not going to apply it to everything. I'm going to be a little bit selective. Picked up some medium because that paint was too opaque, too aggressive. Gonna darken it up. I didn't clean off my brush. It's okay that there's some white in there. See how I've got that brush pressed flat like a chisel? That really helps with the detail work. You could use a Filbert if you prefer, rather than a round brush. I just liked the versatility of the round brush for this. Just a little bit of a shadow there on the highlight side. I'm not going to spend too much time on this chimney. It's kind of incidental. I think it reads as a chimney, and that's good enough for me. So I just kind of left it. Cleaned off my brush. A little more white into that lightest color for the final highlight. Kind of outlining it a bit like I did on the house. Long liner, and we're going to mix up with some of this Payne's gray, some white, just kind of a mid-tone gray. I'm going to warm it up with a tiny bit of the burnt sienna because we're going to do some distant fence posts. I don't know how necessary the brown really was, but it just felt like the right thing to do. A little bit of extra water in there. Oh yeah, I have to do the porch railings. So we're going to do the porch railings first with this color. Let these lines be indistinct. If they kind of break, if you make a line and it doesn't go all the way across, I think that that's okay because it could indicate a break in the wood. It could indicate a discoloration in the wood. It could indicate a shadow, whatever. But I think if these lines are too sharp, too thick, too solid, they're going to look too fake. So let it be really soft and indistinct. That's why I chose to put these on with my long liner. And right here, we're just going to do a couple little fence posts. Make sure that they're not all the exact same distance from each other. Just makes things more interesting. And I'm going to kind of dot along old rails in the fence there. Make sure these rails kind of move off at different directions. Maybe one is broken and it's laying down on the ground. Maybe one angle's down, one angle's up. Whatever it is, just give them each a little bit of a different personality. I just dunked into my white, and we're just giving a suggestion of a highlight on all of these rails and posts that we just did, just like we highlighted everything else. Back to my number 10 round, and again with a nice vibrant grass color. Bright, bright, bright. It's just my 2 yellows and my white this time. No blue, no Payne's gray. The absolute brightest color I've used so far, so I'm going to be very sparing with it. All right, now I've got my chalk pencil again, and I'm just going to rough in where some fence posts are going to be. This was a last minute thing. I had not planned on doing this, so I wasn't real sure of where I wanted these to be. But I'm pretty happy with where they turned out, where I ended up putting them. I like to use them to kind of lead you toward the farmhouse. So you can see that second one, it points to the farmhouse a little bit. And then this one on the far side also angles toward the farmhouse. And I tried to decide on whether I should put one in between them, but ultimately I left it open, and I thought it was a really nice entryway into the painting, guiding you just straight to the farmhouse. Using my number, I don't know, that's my 6 or my 8. I think it's my 6. Just getting some Payne's gray with some water on it, so it's a little on the thinner side. And just kind of roughing in where those shapes are, using the edge of my brush, and then whitening them out just a little bit. I think I added some burnt sienna to that. And then using the rest of that color to really deepen the shadows there at the base of the grasses. So you can't really see where the base of these fence posts are. They don't really go off the edge of the canvas, but you can't see where they end because they're in shadow under the grasses that are blowing around them. Just a little medium to keep that nice and transparent and kind of swoopy and blendy so it doesn't cover everything basically. to my number 10, just mixing up some warm kind of wood colors, and I'm gonna highlight the posts. Now, feel free to experiment here and figure out what colors work best for you for your fence posts. So here I started with a mix of the burnt sienna and yellow ochre, and I think there's some Payne's gray in there. I'm just kind of smoothing that down one side of the different posts. But it didn't feel quite light enough. They still felt very, very dark. So I'm going to mix a little bit more yellow in there and a tiny bit of white. Even some of that yellow, the cadmium yellow. And I was wrong. I was using that for my last few grasses. I promise we're just about done with the grasses, but I can't plop the fence posts on top of the grasses and then just call that good, because they do. They just look slapped on top. So we have to add a few more grasses to kind of integrate it in. I think I had planned on using that for a highlight color and then shifted gears in the middle of mixing and decided that I needed to add a few extra grasses. See the way they overlap those posts helps the posts feel like they're in the scene, they're in the field. They're not an afterthought that's just plastered on top. A little bit of Payne's gray and white in there. This is a nice gray color. And this color I am putting on here. I picked up a little medium as well, so it kind of streaks. This is what I meant by just kind of explore and find out what color mixtures make the wood look old and believable to you in your painting. So you can still see the warm color that I put on there in the first place, but I felt like that gray was nice and made those fence posts look really weathered. Back to my number 6, some Payne's, some blue. Promise we are just about done. Some burnt sienna. I'm just looking for the darkest color that I can get. Dark while still being a little earthy. That's why I'm adding the burnt sienna and not just using solid Payne's gray. A little medium. I just want to make sure the base of that is nice and dark. And then we have one more thing to do and we are done. And notice I'm not covering that entire bottom edge, just giving some nice deep dark places. All right, now we're gonna go back to my long liner. I'm gonna pick up that same color, a little extra water so the paint flows, and we're just gonna create some little wires that are coming off of these fence posts. Really twisty, they kind of disappear into the grasses, maybe pop up again somewhere else. Maybe they just break and disappear altogether. Don't make them too tidy. See how the line kind of breaks there. I think it gives the impression that the grasses are growing up and over it and through it and burying part of it. Just going to poke into a little bit of white, roll it through there, add a hint of a highlight to part of the wire. Not everything, not solid. One final mixture, we're going to mix up that burnt sienna, some yellow ochre, a little bit of white, just a nice warm, super light color. And this is going to be my final highlight on my fence post. Rolled off most of it and then picked up a little medium. Just kind of slash that warm highlight down one side. And that is our Valley Storm painting. Thank you so much, everyone, for painting along with me and for watching. And I hope to see you next time.